Mivart on the Genesis of Species was published just 12 years after, and obviously in response to, Darwin's On the Origin of Species, and in the same year as Darwin's Descent of Man. From Mivart being Darwin's contemporary, we can, through his writings, sample how people at the time responded to Darwin's ideas. And from being both highly intelligent and a highly qualified critic, Mivart was able to submit natural selection to an analysis I don't think has been surpassed. I start with that analysis. Mivart promises to bring to bear on Darwin's ideas familiarity not only with the sciences involved, but also with philosophy and religion. Consideration of religion he strictly limits to a final chapter, but to Darwin's mechanism of natural selection, he brings a remorseless logic. The heart of his method is to ask, what are the properties of species, and given that, could natural selection account for them? Although he writes well and clearly, I found his argument dispersed through several chapters. Here's how I understand it. As suitable examples of how species properties differ, he points to differences in creatures' symmetries. Some are radially symmetrical, others bilaterally. Along with symmetry, he includes segmentation. These are suitable examples because they're readily apparent to all observers, are highly distinctive of species, and highly resistant to change. Where might such properties originate? He starts by considering matter itself. Crystals of inorganic salts can take on alternative forms, symmetries. Snow crystals, for example, can consist of flat sheets and tubes. Species characteristics, are they properties like that of matter? He decides no, since, quote, otherwise incident forces must act upon them, living creatures, and upon non-living aggregations of matter in the same way and with similar effects, end of quote, and he judges they don't. Or do creatures' characteristics develop in response to their environment? He rejects this possibility too, quote, in the immense majority of these instances, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to see how external conditions could have produced or even have tended to produce them, end of quote. Instead, he opts for species characteristics lying within the bodies of living creatures. How can such characteristics arise? Darwin says through a process in nature of selection essentially similar to that practiced by livestock breeders. But Mivart points out that breeders experience their livestock being highly resistant to change beyond quite a limited envelope. Species have quite narrow limits to their variability. Quote, in addition to this immutability of character in some animals, it is undeniable that domestic species have little stability and much tendency to reversion. End of quote. Implicit in Mivart's argument is natural selection, too, will be bound by such envelopes and subject to a similar tendency to reversion, and certainly would be unable to alter such fundamental properties as kinds of symmetry. For changes as substantial as that, some other mechanism must be involved, and if that is so, it could be responsible for all the changes needed for the evolution of new species. Darwin had simply assumed that if natural selection could lead to evolution up to the species level, it could operate at every level on up from that to entire kingdoms. Mivart admits natural selection may affect the relative fitness of individuals within a species, but as a cause of evolution at or above the species levels, he concludes it is insignificant. It is, quote, it is surely inconceivable that indefinite variation with survival of the fittest can ever have built up these serial, bilateral, and vertical homologies, end of quote. So what is the cause? He can't say. But from fragments of some primitive creatures being able to grow back into the whole creature, he concludes the cause must be distributed throughout the bodies of living creatures. Perhaps no more could be supposed before the discovery of ribonucleic acids in the nucleus of every cell. Mivart accepts that natural selection must act. Quote, natural selection acts and must act, though alone it does not appear capable of fulfilling the task assigned to it by Mr. Darwin. It is beset with certain scientific difficulties which must by no means be ignored, and some of which, I venture to think, are absolutely insuperable. End of quote. Only 12 years after Darwin had floated the idea, Mivart marshals against natural selection the same objections that are held against it today. One is what we call irreducible complexity. Quote, obtaining an improvement in an organ by means of several spontaneous variations all occurring together is an impossibility so extreme as to be practically equal to impossibility. End of quote. How could all the variations needed for a new feature prove fit enough to be selected and spread throughout a population, independent of the quite different fitness provided by the new feature once complete? Quote, these complex and simultaneous coordinations could never have been produced by infinitesimal beginnings, since, until so far developed as to affect the requisite functions, they are useless. End of quote. Among his instances of irreducible complexity are the development of whalebone, baleen, in the mouths of the whale, the asymmetrical conditions on the heads of the flatfish, such as the sole, and various forms of mimicry. Quote, here, imitation has attained a development which seems utterly beyond the power of the mere survival of the fittest to produce. And pupation, how natural selection or any laws of correlation can account for the gradual development of such an exceptional process of development, so extremely divergent from that of other insects, seems nothing less than inconceivable. Another difficulty. Natural selection would operate through continuous gradual change, yet fossils testify to species remaining stable, with few intermediaries. Quote, certain fossil traditional forms are absent, which might have been expected to be present. All the more marked, grouped bats, pterodactyls, chelonians, ichthysauria, anuria, etc., appear at once upon the scene. The mass of paleontological evidence is indeed overwhelmingly against minute and gradual modification. We find a remarkable, on Darwin's principles, an inexplicable absence of minutely graduated traditional forms. So, there are grounds for thinking that specific differences must be developed suddenly instead of naturally. End of quote. For Mivart, this is only one of many remarkable phenomena in organic forms upon which natural selection throws no light whatever, but the explanation of which, if they could be attained, might throw light upon specific orientation. Among these he cites the coexistence of closely similar structures of diverse origin, such as similar eyes appearing in both vertebrates and mollusks. Quote, in the cuttlefish we find an eye, even more completely constructed on the vertebrate type than is the ear. Sclerotic, retina, choroid, vitreous humor, lens, aqueous humor, all are present. The correspondence is wonderfully complete, and there can hardly be any hesitation in saying that for such an exact, prolonged and correlated series of similar structures to have been brought about in two independent instances by merely indefinite and minute accidental variations is an improbability which amounts practically to impossibility. End of quote. Through his arguments, Mivart convinces me that Darwin's contemporaries were as capable as we are of assessing the scientific merits of his proposed mechanism of evolution, probably reflecting the experience of many of Darwin's critics. Mivart says of himself, quote, "The author of this book can say that, though by no means disposed originally to dissent from the theory of natural selection, if only its difficulties could be solved, he has found each successive year that deeper consideration and more careful examination have more and more brought home to him the inadequacy of Mr. Darwin's theory to account for the preservation and intensification of incipient, specific, and generic characters, that minute, fortuitous, and indefinite variations could have brought about such special forms and modifications as have been enumerated in this chapter seems to contradict not imagination, but reason." End of quote. How does he now suppose an answer may be found? One way is by seeking a parallel in embryology. It is not improbable that, could we arrive at the causes conditioning all the complex interrelations between the several parts of one animal, we should at the same time obtain the key to unlock the secrets of specific orientation. End of quote. For example, he refers us to the complex life cycle of certain insects. Quote, "The mysterious power by which a particle of structureless sarcode," I think he means a zygote, "develops successfully into an egg, a grub, a chrysalis, a butterfly, all the conditions, cosmical, physical, chemical, and vital, being supplied, are the requisite accompaniments to determine such evolution of species." End of quote. Mivart satisfies one part of my curiosity, how Darwin's contemporaries responded to his proposal for living creatures evolving. Now let's turn to another. How did they deal with what that implied for the origin of human mental facilities such as consciousness? Quote, "Mr. Darwin has asserted in the strongest terms the identity and kind of the mental faculties of men and brutes, and has thoroughly confounded our moral judgments with the gregarious instincts of beasts. Mr. Darwin endeavors to show that there is no difference of kind between these faculties, man's intellectual and moral faculties, and the psychical powers of brutes." End of quotes. In this endeavor, Mivart claims he fails utterly. Quote, "The momentary pang, the present pain which beasts endure, though real enough, is yet doubtless not to be compared as to its intensity with the suffering which is produced in man through his high prerogative of self-consciousness. The result is that man, the totality of his being, and not his anatomy only being considered, is seen to differ from every other animal by a distinction far more profound than any which separates each irrational animal from every other." End of quote. Mivart claims to be speaking for his time. Quote, "The word species denotes a peculiar congeries of characters, innate powers and qualities, and a certain nature realized indeed in individuals, but having no separate existence, except ideally as a thought in some mind. The conviction forces itself on many minds that the organic world is the expression of an intelligence of some kind." End of quote. He quotes qualified atheists as agreeing with his view. Consciousness and its associated sensibilities could be understood only through association with some sort of supernatural being. Alfred Wallace, for example, frequented not churches, but spiritualist seances, hoping to encounter such beings. But Mivart, being a Catholic, cannot so readily abandon Christian doctrine. Quote, "It is a generally received doctrine that the soul of every individual man is absolutely created in the strict and primary sense of the word, that it is produced by a direct or supernatural act, and, of course, that by such an act the soul of the first man was similarly created. His animal body must have had a different source from that of the spiritual soul which informs it, owing to the distinctiveness of the two orders by which those two existences separately belong." End of quote. How has this dilemma been resolved in our day? By evolution becoming the preserver of physicalists, who judge reports of special human faculties, such as consciousness, being illusions, not deserving serious consideration. By my judgment, as a secular dualist like Alfred Wallace, in this respect we've only regressed since Mivart's time.